John is a professor of law at the University of California at Berkeley. His new book is Crisis and Command, a history of executive power from George Washington to George W. Bush. He has published more than 75 scholarly articles on foreign affairs, national security, and constitutional law. His other books are The Powers of War and Peace in 2005 and War by Other Means in 2006. He has contributed to the editorial pages of the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, Washington Post, Los Angeles Times, the Philadelphia Inquirer, and the Chicago Tribune. Professor Yu was a Deputy Assistant Attorney General in the Office of Legal Counsel for the United States Department of Justice, where he worked on national security and terrorism after the September 11th attacks. He also served as General Counsel of the Senate Judiciary Committee and as a law clerk for the Judge Lawrence Silverman of the D.C. Circuit and Justice Clarence Thomas of the United States Supreme Court. Professor Yu graduated from Yale Law School, where he was an articles editor of the Yale Law Journal, and summa cum laude from Harvard College with a degree in American history. Let's give a very warm Silicon Valley welcome to John Yu.
Thank you very much for inviting me to join you for the evening. I'd like to thank Jack Mallory, who invited me, and Richard Mungie and Richard Gino for inviting me to speak to you. I'd like to tell you I welcome any opportunity I have to escape the jurisdiction of the People's Republic of Berkeley, even if only for one day, and come to more liberal places like Silicon Valley. I asked Richard, how many people did you expect to come? And he said maybe about 200 or 300. And I was astounded. I thought, I didn't know all the conservatives in the Bay Area were going to be here. But I'm happy to speak to them. A number of you, I was really enjoyed the chance to mingle and meet many of you beforehand. And the common question I always get is, what are you doing at Berkeley? How did they hire a person like you? Why are you still there? And I always say, and some of you heard me on the Sussman radio show today, don't tell everybody else what I'm about to say. But I always say, well, I feel like I'm West Berlin during the Cold War. I'm a shining beacon of capitalism and democracy surrounded by a sea of Marxists. The scary thing is that most of the students we have in class these days have no idea what the Cold War was, or where West Berlin. There's Berlin, and then there's another one called West Berlin. But it's really a welcome opportunity to come and speak to you about some of the themes of my book, talk a little bit about the book, talk a little bit about the Obama presidency. It's just in its third year. And take questions about the book, about other things, Obamacare, the Constitution, Libya, terrorism policy, how to fix University of California, whatever you'd like to add. It could be a very long evening if it was that last topic. But anything you'd like to ask about. Also, I'll be here afterwards to sign the book if anybody wants to buy it for the very, very affordable price of $20 a copy, which is $10 less than the list price, and the same price it is on Amazon. Although after I sign it, it's possible the price will drop. But I'd be very happy. I noticed I was selling some beforehand, but I know we're in an audience of conservatives, so most of you wanted to know what was in the book first before you bought it. Liberals usually buy the book first and then they don't read it and they leave. It's their attitude towards most types of scientific information. So I'd be very happy to talk with you and sign the book afterwards. So let me talk about the book a little bit first. I started writing this book about 4 years ago, and I wanted to write about what makes some presidents successful and some not, what makes some presidents great and some disasters. And so very helpfully, when I started going on the book tour for this book, that noted scholarly journal, Parade Magazine, did a poll of regular Americans asking them who they thought the greatest presidents in American history were. Very good test of sort of regular people's impressions of the presidency. So who do you think, that Parade magazine, mind you, Parade magazine asking just people on the street, who do you think they said, well, the plurality said was the greatest American president? Carter. Carter? Did someone actually say Carter? Yeah. It's not a serious audience. You sound like some of my students at Berkeley. You know. Clinton, I always used to say Clinton. It's very interesting, you know. I guess I need to go to speak an audience filled with people who are more in touch with regular America who are watching Dancing with the Stars right now, rather than being here to listen to a local audience. No, Kennedy. We say Kennedy. You did. John F. Kennedy, right, is ranked by number one poll. Parade magazine, mind you, is the greatest American president. Right? And where do you think he's ranked by scholars? He's ranked slightly below average. And in fact, he keeps doing worse every year we do the polls among scholars. Because the more we learn about Kennedy, the worse he seems to do. On the other hand, you can understand why most people, not most, but a lot of regular folks on the street might say Kennedy, right? Because he's the first television president, very handsome, charismatic, young, attractive family, died young, but he didn't, if you look back at it, he didn't accomplish that much in his presidency. And in fact, now the scholarly opinion amongst his most recent biographers is that he might have been a little bit reckless, and that some of the crises that occurred in his presidency actually might have been the product of some of his recklessness. The number one president among scholars is George Washington, right? Because he founded the country. He set up many of the practices and institutions of presidency that still exist today. I'll talk about some of those later. Many people at the time of the framing, I think this is true, thought that Washington being president was more important than the Constitution, that people trusted Washington so much that it was the success of the country and the Constitution depended on him becoming the first president. The second greatest president is very close. The second greatest president among scholars, some of you mentioned Abraham Lincoln, right, obviously for bringing us through the Civil War. And the third greatest president, I hate to tell you, is Franklin Roosevelt. Although I'll tell you why I happen to agree with that, but I know you had a speaker, I think 2 months ago, who said Roosevelt was one of the worst presidents in American history. So I'll talk a little bit about Roosevelt. The fourth greatest president, I didn't hear anyone mention, but it's Thomas Jefferson. You remember there's this great line about Thomas Jefferson. John F. Kennedy was giving a speech to the collection of American Nobel Prize winners in the White House, and he said, this is the greatest collection of intelligent people in the White House since Thomas Jefferson used to eat dinner here by himself. I think, however, Thomas Jefferson was, in many ways, would have had a failed presidency but for one thing, which was the purchase of Louisiana, where, mind you, he actually did something he personally thought was unconstitutional, because he didn't think the country could actually expand its borders without a constitutional amendment. Fifth greatest president is Teddy Roosevelt. A little bit more on him later. The sixth greatest president, I would have thought this, some of you may have said it, but I didn't really hear very clearly in this audience, is Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan is a great example of why you need to wait a little bit before you make a judgment on a president. Ronald Reagan, when he left office, was considered by many academics, according to the polls at that time. By the way, we do poll academics because we don't have a lot to do to amuse ourselves. But when we did the polls, we do these regular polls ranking presidents. Reagan was rated a mediocre president, way below average. And it's only been at the benefit of context and time that we've seen Reagan was responsible not just for the economic recovery, but for our victory during the Cold War. And so he has steadily moved up. It still amazes me when I see the polls that now, given what people used to say about him 20, 25 years ago, that now he's ranked the sixth greatest president in American history. That's really something. Seventh greatest president, Harry Truman. I didn't hear many people mention, but Harry Truman, who became president at the start of the Cold War, set the basic policies of containment that carried us through all the way to the end of the Cold War in 1989, 1990. For that, he's thought by many historians to be the seventh greatest president. The 8th greatest president in American history, I didn't hear anybody mention it, people rarely mention it, but it's Dwight Eisenhower. And he's also a good example of why your current impressions of presidents may be different, or you might change them once you learn more about them. Because Dwight Eisenhower, you may remember, was thought of as a grandfatherly, golf-playing president who was out of touch with regular people, out of touch with politics. But it turned out, once the archives were open, that Dwight Eisenhower was very much in charge of his administration and was very much in making many of the basic policy decisions, but he didn't want people to know that he was in charge, that much in charge. He actually preferred that people think of him as this kind of out-of-touch, grandfatherly president. But this is a guy who was, right, the leader of the Allied military in the West. I mean, he was the person who knew how to run things. He actually had this general, former retired general, who went with him everywhere he went as president, solely for the purpose of recording every meeting he was in and writing down everything everybody said. And once we were able to look at those papers 35 years afterwards, it was apparent that Eisenhower was an incredibly commanding president. I'll give you one little story. When Eisenhower was president, you remember there were these little islands off of Taiwan called Quemoy and Matsu, and that the Chinese communists, as we used to call them before they bought all our debt, the Chinese communists would periodically shell Quemoy and Matsu whenever they wanted to jangle our chain. Well, the first time they seriously did this, they had a cabinet meeting, and every member of the National Security Council, including the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and Vice President Richard Nixon, voted to launch a preemptive nuclear strike on the Chi-Coms, what it's supposed to call them. The only person in the room who said no was Eisenhower. Right? It was just a stunning display of presidential power and command of his administration, that he overruled all his military advisors and decided we wouldn't launch a preemptive strike. But he didn't say who we're going to sell our national debt to 30 years later or 40 years later. But I thought that was a pretty good display of presidential prudence. The 9th greatest president in American history no one ever gets, but if it weren't for him, we wouldn't be sitting here in California listening to this great speaker and buying his books. And that's James Polk, right? James Polk, the most successful first one-term president in our history, who deliberately provoked the Mexican-American War of 1848. He was a president who was so unpopular that when he campaigned for the presidency, he promised, "I will not run for a second term." I wish more people would do that nowadays. He was that unpopular. When he became president, he ordered Zachary Taylor, who later became president, was then a general, to defend American territory along the Rio Grande River from Mexican aggression by moving his troops between Mexican troops and the rest of Mexico, so that the only way they could retreat would be to attack our forces coming back home into Mexico. This was a skirmish of a few hundred troops. President Polk's proportionate, deliberate response was to launch an amphibious invasion of Mexico, capture Mexico City, and engage in what we now call regime change. And in the process, to take 1/3 of the best territory in Mexico and add it to the United States. For that, he's considered the 9th greatest president, but he kept his promise. He did not run for re-election, so he's also our most successful one-term president.
John, you are a war criminal.
Yeah.
You are guilty of high crimes against humanity. Torture is a war crime, and you are guilty of
I just want to say I'm very glad that he had the opportunity to contribute $10 to the organization. But I hope you remember, I'm sure he's going to come to the Tea Party thing in 10 days too. Except usually those guys don't end up paying any taxes. So the 10th president is Andrew Jackson, right, who introduced the sort of modern democratic, also was a very warlike fellow himself. I mean, Andrew Jackson